I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today about sustainability and ESG. And my presentation does take a little bit of a focus on reporting. I think in Jason's presentation we did see reporting at the end of things when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions and methane. But reporting standards in a way are like the tail that wags the dog, because reporting, you can't report on stuff that you're not doing. So a lot of the standards ask questions about what's your policy, what's your target, as well as your metrics and indicators. And that's quite a deliberate strategy in the sustainability piece. So I'd like to just start off with a couple of definitions, because this is something that's that really plays on the mind of people who are new to the area, or even people who say they've been in the area a long time. So when we talk about sustainability and ESG, we're actually talking about some different things, and I'll return to this a little bit later in the presentation. But sustainability is really derived from sustainable development, which was a United Nations position taken a number of years ago, that it looks at meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And if that sounds a little bit nebulous, it's probably because it is. And it's really focused on what sort of impact organisations have on the environment and society and people, and what contributions those same organisations can make in terms of progress of trying to enhance the environment, improve society, and also prosperity all at the same time. ESG, on the other hand, is a relatively new concept. So that was coined around 2004 by the United Nations Environment Programme Finance Initiative, and that's a really important distinction. So ESG is largely really a concept of looking at environment, social and governance factors along with financial factors. So it is a term that's been coined by the finance sector in response to some of these issues, and it's very risk focused when it comes to business and organisations. And I'll come back to those definitions shortly. But what I'd like to focus on are 5 sort of shifts that we're seeing in sustainability and ESG at this point. One is certainly the growth in what we call ESG funds, or the ESG industry, which I'll describe shortly. So we've got a lot of value being attributed to funds and money that's been screened to some extent, either for its positive or negative impacts on environment and society. So Bloomberg has estimated, and I have to put my glasses on for this, Bloomberg has estimated that the ESG assets are expected to reach $50 trillion by 2025 and have surpassed $35 trillion. And the question is, if that's the case, if so many funds are being screened for their environmental and social impacts, why are we still wringing our hands and in a little bit of trouble here when it comes to environmental progress? The next major shift is around the role of rating and ranking organisations. So some businesses here will be currently being rated by ESG rating organisations and scored for their performance on environmental and social factors. And I'll talk about that as well. The third trend is around reach. So the reach of standards and the reach and interest of investors is getting much wider up and down the value chain. So the reporting standards are looking deeper and deeper into those relationships all up and down that space. The fourth one is on the pace of change, which has been incredible in the past 5 years. There's been probably more activity in the past 5 than the past 25. And what that might mean, why is acceleration important? And finally, regulation. So what's going on in Australia? How are regulators responding to this? And what sort of rules are being put in place that you might be subject to? They're all pretty important as well. So I'll just start off with the first one on the growth of ESG investing and the dollars that are at stake. Paul Clements Hunt was arguably the person who coined the term, or the acronym ESG, when he was working at the UNEP finance initiative. And even he said earlier this year, his observation was that the obsession with easy money making was overriding everything else. So what we have at the moment is a situation where there's lots of dollars at stake, lots of interest in investors putting their money into things where they see a positive environmental outcome, positive social outcomes, and divesting from things they see as having negative impacts on the environment and on society. At the same time, there's too few rules. And I think we've all probably seen what happens in the finance sector when there's lots of money to be made, not enough rules, what could go wrong, right? So we're playing catch up in terms of these rules. And you'll see from this, this graph that's from the Responsible Investment Association of Australasia. They do a survey every couple of years looking at consumer interest in investment and banking. So they ask questions around superannuation, where people want to invest their money or assume their money is being invested. And you'll see from this that there's certainly a push away from certain activities. They also ask questions about what you want to invest in. So this whole notion of people's super, or expecting that their superannuation is going into things that are good and being diverted from things that are bad, there's a general expectation that that's happening. At the same time, you do have a lot of institutional investors working this as well and creating financial products for people to invest in. A review of 130 climate-themed investment funds worth $67 billion in total net assets, about more than half of them were not aligned to the Paris Agreement targets on climate change. So they were labelled as a climate-friendly investment product for people to invest in. The companies in that product included Chevron and ExxonMobil. And yeah, less than half of them were aligned to those targets towards net zero. And so this has led to a fair bit of interest in potential regulation. And we've seen greenwashing interest as well, which I'll talk about in a sec. But HSBC was recently outed for one of their sustainable bonds for doing this same sort of thing, that what was on the label wasn't really tested to be accurate. So there's a little bit of rulemaking to come. At the same time, we've got the rating and ranking organisations increasing their popularity over the past 5 to 10 years. There used to be hundreds of these. There's still quite a few. And these organisations were originally sort of boutique or cottage rating shops, looking at environmental, social and governance factors of a whole bunch of listed companies. And what they do is essentially assess companies across those parameters on what they can publicly find out about them from their websites, their annual reports, and then they score them based on their environmental and social performance or their risk profiles. And these have become mainstream in the past 5 years. So what we've seen is that the mainstream investment shops and rating organisations like Standard & Poor's, Morningstar, Morgan Stanley, FTSE Russell, all of them have bought up these ESG rating shops and brought them in under their finance lens. So they've become quite mainstream and they're looked to. And what these organisations do is essentially assess companies and sell that advice to investors and prospective investors in terms of what they're buying. One of the things I'm using to point out here is it's become mainstream, but they also ask a lot of questions right down to supply chain. So I've just got an example there of the sort of question that Sustainalytics asks when it comes to deforestation. They're wanting to know where you're getting your feed from. They want to know what the conditions under which that feed was procured. They're wanting to know about your production systems in relation to deforestation as well. These guys also make, sorry, I've got a little bit of animation there. These guys also make their scores public. The reports and the detailed assessments, which might be up to 50 pages long, you have to buy or subscribe to their services, but that's what they're selling. They use different methodologies, and sometimes they're seen as being a little bit of a black box. You'll see here, this is from Sustainalytics, where a high number, so anything 40 or over, is considered a fairly extreme risk in terms of ESG for investors. And what they've done here is look at ExxonMobil and Tesla to start with. If we look at those, 36.5, 28.5. This is what made Elon Musk throw his toys out of the cot. This is well before Twitter, so earlier this year. Elon Musk saw that Tesla was getting a worse score, so a lower score in that sense than some of the others, and really got quite upset. So not on this one, but on the S&P 500, Tesla was booted out and was getting a worse score than ExxonMobil. On this particular rating, they're a bit more generous, but you'll also see that British American Tobacco gets a better score than either Tesla or ExxonMobil. So that kind of begs the question on what's the methodology behind some of these ratings. On the right there I have some companies that are a bit more closer to home for you, but they're in the 40s. So Sustainalytics see this particular sector as being quite high risk. And they're looking at multiple areas of greenhouse gas emissions, water security, but also labour practices, governance issues around bribery and corruption and the like. But some of the news there is our good friends in the plant-based protein area aren't faring very well either in terms of Beyond Meat. But companies can game some of these. So British American Tobacco is well aware of what constitutes a good score under this. They know that they can score high in certain parameters, and a single number is being used here. So this is an area that is really overripe for regulation, but in the meantime, if you're a listed company or if you're in the supply chain of a listed company, this advice is going to investors and prospective investors, and they are using it. In terms of this possible regulation, the International Organisation of Securities Commissions has recommended that this industry be regulated, so this is something worth watching. In the US, this is a really polarised debate. There's a US Senate lead that has written to these rating organisations asking for their methodologies. They're not going to get them. But also Mike Pence has described ESG as woke capitalism. Elon Musk has described it as the devil incarnate. And the states of Texas, Florida and Missouri have regulated that state pension funds should not invest in anything that has an ESG screen. So there's a really polarised debate in the US, like a lot of other things are at the moment. The next piece I wanted to talk about was the reach of some of these standards and some of the ratings as well. And this is from the European Commission. When Carolina spoke earlier, she talked about the Green Deal. This regulation is part of that package of the Green Deal out of the EU. And it's called the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. So this is a law. It will require more than 30,000 companies domiciled in the EU to publicly report on their sustainability impacts and risks. There's 12 topics, including things like biodiversity, and assurance, third-party assurance, will be mandatory. And here's an example of the reach of that. This is just the standard on biodiversity, where they're asking for this sort of information. What's your policy and your performance across your value chain? So even if companies are domiciled in the EU, if they're bringing stuff in or they've got operating companies in other parts of the world, they'll be subject to this. So it reaches that stretch, makes this almost a de facto global standard in its own right. At the same time, the financial reporting standards are changing as well, and we have the first two financial reporting standards, one that's a general disclosure, another one on climate change. And we have the Scope 3 emissions being included there. So that's emissions in the supply chain. So anyone that's in the meat industry in terms of processing or retail, to that extent, what goes on farm constitutes part of your Scope 3 emissions. So we're getting more and more requests about what's going on and how do you quantify that at farm level and all through your value chain. And we're expecting that to become part of the disclosure. So companies will be expected to report against these things in a mandatory way in the future. The pace of change is also increasing pretty markedly as well. So we have at the moment the financial reporting standards, which I've just mentioned. There's 2 exposure drafts released, and they're going to be finalised in the next 12 months. The European standards, which we mentioned, 12 exposure draft standards released. The first reports will be in 2025 using 2024 data. And that will become a significant impost on European companies as they try to get data when their impacts are mostly, a lot of them will be in other parts of the world. The Global Reporting Initiative, which I'm involved with, we've just released updated universal standards which take effect next year, and also a dedicated sector standard for agriculture, which I'll talk about in a sec. And it's not surprising that while we're speaking here today, that in Egypt, the chair of my standards board, I'm vice chair, but the chair of the standards board is on a panel with the reporting standards for finance, talking at the finance session at COP27. So how sustainable finance will work in terms of solving climate change issues is part of that discussion at the COP, and to what extent we can make some of this reporting mandatory by business. With the agriculture sector piece, this was released in June, and it's worth looking at the website, and they're free to download. What it does is publish a list of topics that are likely to be material if you have a business or organisation working in the agriculture, aquaculture and fishing sectors. It also has indicators and metrics referenced in there as well. And you'll also see that food security is a newish topic that's central to the agriculture sector standard. There's a bunch of topics in there around labour practices as well, because this is a global standard, as well as climate change and animal welfare. And I can share with you that animal welfare will be a topic where the Global Reporting Initiative will develop a dedicated topic-specific standard probably in the next 2 or 3 years, and certainly lean heavily on the work that Carolina was talking about earlier with the changes to the European animal welfare regime. So that's a space to follow as well, and we'll be certainly looking for people to be on a working group to develop that material and consult on that. But this also speaks to some of the themes that Matthias Cormann was talking about earlier today, that overall challenge of food security going forward. So feeding more people with less resources and in a changing climate is our main challenge in terms of going forward with this kind of standard and reporting. How do we do that? How do we disclose and make clear to people, including investors, but all sorts of stakeholders, what that work actually looks like and what that work means? In terms of the local regulatory response, so already some businesses in the room may be required to report because we have dedicated legislation on specific topics in Australia. There has been some talk about rolling them together and just having an overall thing like the Europeans are doing, but I think we're a little ways off from that. But we do have dedicated regulation already for companies of certain sizes, or depending on their impacts, around reporting on their Scope 1 and 2 greenhouse gas emissions, on reporting on gender and workplace diversity, and also reporting on water and things like modern slavery, so child labour, forced labour in the supply chain and in operations. So there's a bunch of things that organisations are already reporting on in this space. Added to that, we've got ASIC has started to flag some concerns around greenwashing, and they're looking to make examples of organisations. So if you're an organisation that goes out and talks about your great plan to be carbon neutral 3 weeks from last Thursday, and there's not a detailed plan that goes with that, then you may be in the sights of one of the regulators, either the ACCC or ASIC, when it comes to some of these sorts of claims. So they're quite public, and you can see that on their website. ASIC has already published material for finance companies and institutions about what sort of claims are valid or not. So if your superannuation fund is out there talking about its lovely climate-friendly portfolio, or its sustainable product, or a bank that's talking about its ESG lending, these are all subject now to that guidance from ASIC about what constitutes a sustainable fund or not. And that's a growing area. The other one to watch is the Australian Sustainable Finance Institute, and that's available on their website as well. They have started to develop what we're calling a green finance or sustainable finance taxonomy. Now, the EU has done this already, Japan has done this already, where they look at what sorts of economic activity qualifies as environmentally sustainable. So what sort of industry classifications are going to be inside or outside of this lens of being considered sustainable? That will help craft how investment opportunities move going forward and tightening up these regulations. You'll be pleased to know that the federal budget recently had $6 million aside in a line item to develop and introduce climate reporting standards for large businesses and financial institutions in Australia. So that flags that the federal government and Treasury are looking very closely at what's going on internationally, absorbing and reflecting on that, and considering what sort of mandatory climate reporting and disclosure business is likely to need going forward. So just getting towards the business end of this now is, what does this all mean in terms of going back to the sustainability versus ESG discussion? So things are a bit difficult when the ESG rating and ranking organisations start bickering amongst themselves, and this is what's happened. So Bloomberg's done a little bit of a whistleblower piece called the ESG Mirage, and has basically pointed out that ESG is not about saving the world, it's about saving the business. So in that sense, ESG as it is currently practiced is not really looking at the relationship back to sustainable development. It's not tethered necessarily to any environmental or social realities. It's basically looking at protecting a business from risks associated with reputation damage, maybe risks associated with climate change, and how to protect shareholders' money. That is quite a different argument to how you're impacting on sustainable development and reducing your impact on the environment and society. And so there's these two streams of thought playing out at the same time. And to some extent, ESG's a little bit of a growing pain for the finance sector, trying to get its head around what this sustainability or sustainable development piece looks like. So Paul Clements-Hunt, who I mentioned before, who coined that term, is saying, doesn't really matter what the acronym is, we need to make things real again when it comes to sustainable finance. And to some extent, it's like watching the finance sector kind of poking its head up and trying to work out what this means. Where are the opportunities? Where are the risks? How can more money be moved into the right places to solve some of these problems? At the moment, it's starting with a very narrow sort of risk piece. There's lots of mistakes being made in terms of methodologies with the ranking organisations, and there's really very little expertise in the finance sector. Our good friends at Rabobank excluded, of course, but when you meet someone who has ESG analyst in their title and they're from a bank or a finance institution, have a long look at their history on LinkedIn, because very few people who have ESG in their title have much E, much S, and sometimes very little G. So it is a growth area, and that's one of the difficulties here. I'd question pretty much everything. So the tightening of the rules that we're seeing will start to impact on how these things cascade through the banking and finance sector and what goes on farm. So things like your carbon offset regimes and biodiversity regimes, what you get paid for and why and what the rules are starting to shift at a macro level, and that will play itself out onto the ground. So just in the last minute, where does this kind of leave us? You know, some practical advice in terms of all this change going on, global trends and the like. The first thing is to know your impacts in both directions. So what will stand you in good stead as a business organisation is to look at, well, how does my business impact on the environment? Is it on water? Is it on carbon? Is it on something else when it comes to the environment? Also on society and people. What sort of labour standards are in place? What's going on in my supply chain? Do I have a reliable or good line of sight on what sorts of standards my suppliers are using or are attributing to? What sort of information is needed further downstream as well? So understanding your impacts is the first piece, and then you can reflect on how that might impact on your business, or come back to impact on your business as a cost or as a reputational risk. The second thing is to be alert to stakeholders. So what questions are customers and investors and banks asking you? But engage with why they're asking it. You're probably in receipt of some things that look like a bit of a tick box. That's because it's still early days, and my advice would be to have a conversation, because the finance sector is not the keeper of scientific truth on these things. They don't know what's going on in your business nearly as much as you do, and they never will. So Jason, can you imagine having that conversation with your bank? Jason's explanation earlier about methane cycling and soil carbon. They're complex conversations that the pro forma tick box that you get from ESG raters or investors or even customers just aren't there yet. Be prepared, so do your homework and provide the evidence. So as Michael Bloomberg says, you know, in God we trust, everyone else bring data. That is still really important. So understanding your scientific evidence and your data collection is still really important on those impacts. And finally, expect change. Some rules are still under construction, so it's still a bit like the Wild West, but as we've seen with ASIC and the ACCC, there are new sheriffs coming to town, and you should be aware of that too. Happy to take some questions. Thank you.
So, questions if we have them, please. I'll get to you, Terry. I just need to hang on 2 seconds. How are we going? Further on? Go for it, Terry. The mic's yours. Sorry, Rob. You
Could businesses, companies who claim sustainability on say 1 or 2 grounds, either carbon, biodiversity, even labour, or even just naturalness of their commodity, be seen as deficient and potentially even at risk of greenwashing claims if they're not dealing with, say, another issue such as animal welfare, according to consumers, and you know that's basically where it comes down to. And could they potentially be at risk of, similar to what's happened to H&M, of regulatory action?
Yeah, certainly. You know, the ACCC is looking closely at this now from a product perspective. ASIC is certainly looking from a finance sector perspective, and individual listed companies. So the claims companies are making in their marketing and sustainability reporting. For an individual product or claim, the ACCC is sort of up in attention on that at the moment. And the advice would be if you do have a specific area of performance that you've focused on, like carbon, or perhaps it's forced labour, or perhaps it's one part of your value chain. If you do want to make a claim on something, to keep it specific to that effort. So in terms of saying we're greener than green 3 weeks from last Thursday, we're best performers in our class, the notion would be to make if you're going to make a definitive claim, that you need to bring that evidence. So the notion would be being able to measure what that outcome is, and also perhaps have that measure verified by a third party. So when we look at some of the prosecutions, it's mostly been because there hasn't been a reliable certification standard that people have necessarily used. And for a lot of these claims, there are verified certification standards that are capable of being assured by a third party. So it's lining up your claim, the evidence you're collecting to back that up, and having some sort of assurance or certification standard that goes with it. Equally, there are other areas where, you know, all of that machinery or instrumentation doesn't exist yet, but it's still, you know, mimicking that regime of verification, measuring, and disclosing that. So back yourself up.
How are we going? Look like we're, brought on a rush. I'll go with the gentleman on the right, or who's going to do it?
Thanks, Robyn. That was excellent, as usual. I'm really interested in what you think about the sort of next stages of litigation around this kind of thing. Yeah, because reading, because it's my idea of a good time, reading some legal papers lately, some academic pieces around how litigation has really increased since the bushfires of 1920 in Australia, where organisations or people, civil suits even, are sort of saying, well, we've come out of this in a really bad way. No one will insure us because of extreme climate events, or we can't afford it anymore. We want some money. So, you know, that's one of the reasons why we're seeing, you know, well, one of the reasons why we're seeing this increase in litigious behaviour. And, for example, the EPA are being sued in Victoria. Can you sort of see that that's going to grow moving forward, that people are going to start really wanting to point the finger at so many organisations where they've had record profits for the last 10 years. You know, the CEOs have had 900 pay rises and wages are in decline. I'm sort of seeing this perfect storm of a big bloody shit fight, quite frankly.
Yeah, I think there's two sort of responses to that. And one is that we sort of tend to go to the courts when there aren't other remedies or regulations, right? So the fact that the ACCC and ASIC are starting to move on some aspects of enforcing some of these things is one piece. So we expect to see increasing regulation and tightening of rules. But at the same time, we often expect the US to be quite a litigious country. Australia has one of the biggest backlogs of climate litigation in the world. And it's across multiple different aspects of law, the Corporations Act, but also in terms of contract law and Superannuation Act and all kinds of legislation. So you can go to the Solicitor General's website, has a paper on this that's looking at the different types of laws that relate to climate change that different organisations or individuals are using to seek some remedy or seek some clarification. So some of them are activist groups, so there are shareholder activist groups that are having a crack at Santos for what it said or didn't say in its annual report when it comes to climate change and its reliance on carbon capture and storage. Those sorts of things, but equally there are people who are, you know, aggrieved and seeking some financial remedy. And we also have climate litigation funders who are looking for cases to fund. So they're looking for plaintiffs that they can fund and get a slice of that action too, because they know it's an area that's ripe for change. Yeah. Where this plays out, as the court cases get heard or maybe settled, there'll be some clarity about what's okay, what's not okay, who gets remedied, who doesn't, in terms of winners and losers, and under lots of different circumstances. Yeah.
If you can guarantee me that your question will take less than 10 seconds and Robyn can do it in about the same.
We'll be brief.
We'll do it.
Thank you very much. Munro Hardy from Mutual Food and Fibre, and thank you, Robyn, for your presentation. Very interesting. You mentioned you're interested in working with people as consultants, and just wondering who that might be, if it's producers or other stakeholders through the supply chain or otherwise. And if there are people in the audience today who are interested in that, how do we get involved?
Oh, absolutely. So the Global Reporting Initiative, the standards board I work to, it serves in the public interest. It's multi-stakeholder in its governance. So we do deliberately have representation from business, labour organisations, civil society, investors, and equally from different parts of the world. So it has to be geographically diverse. So we put together working groups to develop different topic-specific standards or sector standards, and they're all an open call, global call. So if you go to the GRI website and sign up to the newsletter, that will always have what sort of opportunities are coming up, and you can apply to be on a working group depending on who else might be representing. But we have a deliberate structure of stakeholder engagement, multi-level representation, and multiple types of stakeholders. So I think that's a really important thing for organisations to avail themselves of, and I'm always keen for Australians to be represented so they can then talk about what the new standards are looking like. But yeah, happy to have a chat offline too.